Yeah, we were talking about what you could believe. Grab a cup of coffee. Come on, sit with us for a little bit. And we'll talk about how we can understand and respond. We talked a little bit about what we could believe and what we couldn't. And we actually talked about putting a microphone back in through the ages so that we could actually hear and record Jesus. We could hear what he said. We could see what actually happened. We had like a videotape of what he was doing, how it worked, and you could see the reactions of the people. Yeah, but the problem is they didn't have videotapes back then, and they didn't have microphones and recorders. So what God did was he put a person with a sharp mind, an intelligent mind. I mean, everybody that ever studies the story of John says this is a very highly educated individual. His language shows a tremendous range of vocabulary. His use of grammar and diction and all the other kinds of things that he uses is a very, very experienced, very high level of intelligence and education. He is a very, very wealthy person to be able to afford to have gone to school and gone through all of the training that was involved. To be able to understand, he knew the intricacies of law. If you read the Gospel of John, the story of John, you'll realize he was trained in the law of their land. In Jewish law, in Jewish customs, God's law needed to be taught by God's lawyers. The Sanhedrin Council, John was not a member of the Sanhedrin Council. He was not one of the official leaders of the Jewish people, but he knew all of them, and he called them by name. He understood who they were and how they operated within the framework of the Sanhedrin. How do we know that? Bob, you say that? You can't know that. You can't know that. Well, several times in the story of John, the man who's writing the gospel walks into the inner chamber of the chief priest, into the inner chamber of the Sanhedrin Council, and listens and records the dialogue of what they're talking about as they were listening to Jesus. I think they actually gave him responsibility to go and follow Jesus and bring back accurate reports. You see, they wanted to know for sure too. They wanted to know for certain what was happening out there. Okay, so there's John. Wealthy, educated, schooled in the law. He understood what testimony was and how you could mess it up. You know how to mess up a testimony, don't you? You tell a lie. You start telling a lie, then everybody kind of goes, well, if that's a lie, then everything else could be a lie, and how do we know which is the lie and which is the truth? John has a problem. He has to tell the truth every single time. All right? So he knows. In the discussion, you can hear about the testimony. My testimony is not sufficient. I have to have those that testify for me. If you listen to that, that's a lawyer talking. That's a lawyer defining how it was second nature of him to figure out who you could believe and who you couldn't. Who was telling the truth and who wasn't. Okay. So he's young. He's wealthy. He's trained in the Jewish law. He's friends with most of the people on the Sanhedrin Council. He's a powerful man from a powerful family. He has to be. Oh, you say, Bob, you can't know that, you can't know that, you can't know that. Well, yeah, I can. All right. For instance, on the night that Jesus is arrested, John, running with Peter, along behind the soldiers after they had arrested Jesus, comes to the house of Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas is the high priest. He's the man who's in charge, all right? And there's only one of those. And he's a very important guy. And his house sits way up on the side of the hill with the wealthy people, surrounded by walls, and with a guard at the gate. I mean, there are actual soldiers in there guarding him from being disturbed. And they've called a special session of the Jewish leadership, and they met at his house. It has to be a pretty good sized house because there are a lot of people in there. And the courtyard inside the wall is filled with people. John doesn't seem to have any problem at all. He just walks right past the guard who's looking at the gate of the courtyard there, and walks right straight through the courtyard past all the soldiers and all the people. And he's not held up. He's not restricted in any way. He walks straight into the front door of Caiaphas' house and walks into the place where Jesus is on trial. Into the house of the high priest. You say, Bob, that could be just one story that was made up. That could just be one imaginary story of what might have happened on the inside of the house of Caiaphas during the hidden trial when nothing was made public. Well, but that's not the end of the story. Well, wait a minute. You got to go back. John looks back across the courtyard, the story goes, and sees that Peter is not from Jerusalem. Peter didn't grow up there. Peter didn't have the right clothes on. Peter didn't even smell like a guy from Jerusalem. I mean, he probably smelled a little bit like fish. He was from Galilee, and he dressed like a Galilean, and he was obviously not one of the inner circle. So there was a person there standing, you can't go in there, telling Peter he couldn't go in. John left the inner chamber, came back across the courtyard, talked to the lady who was actually guarding the gate, and said, don't worry about him, he, Peter, is with me. He is with me. You can go ahead and trust him because I'll vouch for him. That's interesting. That's, of course, when Peter gets into trouble. He's surrounded by the enemy, you might say. There are guards there. There are people who were not happy with what's going on. The trial of Jesus is going very badly. And there are a lot of people who are upset. And something big's going down here. And so Peter, surrounded by the enemy, that's when he denies Jesus the 3 times, because to say out loud, yeah, I accept Jesus as my Savior, as my Lord, he's my master, he's the one I've been following for 3 years. Good grief, he'd be right in there next to him, on trial. Well, so he denied Jesus. But how did he get in there? John let him in. That means he's a pretty powerful guy. Yeah, but that doesn't prove anything. That doesn't prove that he's a very powerful person or he's from a very powerful family. It doesn't prove anything, right? Okay. So the next morning, after they have Jesus, and they decide they have to have him executed, John does a nice job telling us how it happened and what took place in there. He also tells us that it took him to the fortress of Antonia. And in the fortress of Antonia, they have a trial by Pilate, the Roman governor. Now, let me explain how this works. Not just anybody can walk through the gates of the Roman fortress of Antonia. if you were called by the Romans, or arrested by the Romans, dragged in there by the Romans, you could get on the inside of the fortress of Antonia. But if you were a normal, everyday person, that was a very secure place. There were a lot of really bad guys with really sharp swords and spears that didn't want everyday people walking around in the middle of the courtyard of their fortress. They kind of disapproved of people being there that weren't really supposed to be there. So how did you get in there? Well, John walked along with the high priests and the leaders of the Sanhedrin council. Walked right in with them. They didn't stop him. They encouraged him, come on, let's go take Jesus to Pilate. And so, as a group, they moved through the city without challenging the writer of the story, right through the gates of the fortress of Antonia, because they were very powerful people, and they could call an audience with Pilate without any difficulty. And then John reports what happens as Pilate begins to investigate and dialogue with the chief priests and the leaders of the temple. He records it, just like it was a videotape or like it was an audio tape. He's actually there in the middle of the fortress of Antonia, listening. That's pretty impressive. And let me take it one more step. Pilate doesn't want to just condemn Jesus because they said so. So he takes Jesus into a private room, into a private area, away from the chief priests and the high priest in the Sanhedrin council. And the story is told in the Gospel of John of the discussion they have back and forth on a private one-to-one conversation between Jesus and Pilate. No, wait a minute. Let's stop here. If John says in one place, there's nothing I have written down here that isn't an eyewitness testimony, how could he write about what happened when Pilate and Jesus talk about authority? You know, I have authority to kill you. You know, Pilate's telling Jesus, you know I have authority. I have life and death authority over you. And Jesus simply quietly says in response, you have no authority over me that hasn't been given to you from above. And he was being accurate. Caesar gave Pilate the authority to be in control. But even more than that, God gave Pilate the authority to crucify him, because that was a part of God's plan too. So everything that Pilate was given to do, the authority he had to do it, according to Jesus, was given to him from some higher level. And he was only to be responsible for what he was given from above. All right, now that was an interesting conversation, terribly insightful. John had to be there or he wouldn't have had a chance to record it. He didn't record the birth narrative. The other three Gospels, or the other two of the Gospels, tell about his birth. John wasn't there when he was born, or when the angels talked to Matthew, or the angels spoke to Mary. He doesn't tell about the childhood of Jesus. He doesn't tell about him going to the temple. He didn't see it happen. He wouldn't have been born yet, from what I can tell. He doesn't have any story about going up on the Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Tabor. The other Gospels have that, all three of them. And it talks about how Moses and Elijah came and shared with Jesus on the mountain. But it's very clear it's only Peter, James, and John, of the 12. In the Gospel of John, those 12 individuals were called the 12, capital T 12, the ones that God had chosen, Jesus had chosen as his followers. And John isn't one of those 12. He fully expected that. So John wasn't there to witness that, so he doesn't tell about it. He doesn't tell about Jesus' journey out into the desert to be tempted by Satan. He doesn't tell about that. Why? Because he wasn't there. It was Jesus alone. He doesn't have the Garden of Gethsemane prayer, where Jesus is in the garden praying that the Father will take away the cup of sorrow and grief and pain and sin that he's going to accept the next day. Well, why doesn't he tell about that? Because he wasn't there. He tells about what he saw, what he heard, and what happened. On a couple of occasions in the first chapter, he tells about how he feels and what he believes and what he thinks about this Jesus experience. But those are the conclusions after a 3-year event of traveling with him, going back and forth. He knew Jerusalem backwards and forward. He knew every street corner. He knew all the leaders of the community. He knew everybody that was involved. He was a friend of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, as though he had grown up in their house. That was Uncle Lazarus or something like that. They were close. He knew the city. He knew the temple. He knew the community. He knew the Roman guards. He knew the Fortress of Antonio. He knew Calvary. He knew Golgotha. And he wrote it all down for us, so we could know for sure that it was true.